And so I can also go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Brooke McDonald, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Blue Hill Heritage Trust. And thank you so much for coming to our Friends from the Field webinar today. I am joined by my co-host, Martha Bell, from the Island Heritage Trust. She's an environmental educator there, so you probably know her. And our two organizations collaborate on these Friends from the Field webinars every month. We have them from September through May. So this is our first one of the season. We're really excited to have our friend Danielle with us. But before I introduce her, I'm going to turn it over to you, Martha, if you don't mind, to go over a few things about Zoom.
Sure. Just two features that I want to point out. One is the question and answer button, where if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to type them in and then we'll answer them at the end. And the other option would be to raise your hand if you'd like to ask the question yourself. And we can make that happen as well. So either option works.
Great, thank you. So today's talk is called Black Terns and Other Marsh Rarities, and we will be learning about the habits and habitats of black terns and other rare birds that can be found in Maine's marshes. Our presenter is Danielle D'Auria, who is the bird group leader in the Wildlife Diversity section of the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Danielle is an expert on secretive marsh birds, wading birds, common loons, great blue herons, black terns, and many, many other bird species. Her current work focuses on understanding statewide populations of waterbird species, as well as land management issues that affect the watersheds and wetlands that they depend on. She has a passion for getting people of all ages outdoors and interested in conservation and fieldwork. And I'd like to personally add that she's a fabulous educator, and we're really thrilled to have her today. So with that, Danielle, I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thanks so much, Brooke and Martha. It's good to see friendly faces. I will go ahead and share my screen. Just give me a moment here. Make sure I do it correctly, and then I'll put it in presenter mode. Okay. Are you seeing my slides?
Yes.
I can see you. Okay, good. So I work, as Brooke said, for Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. I'm what they consider a species specialist. So I have certain species that I focus on, which are all these mostly freshwater wetland birds like the black tern and some other marsh birds. And I'm really responsible for kind of understanding their populations on a statewide scale to know which species are rare and which ones might need our attention and conservation actions on the ground. So today I'm first gonna just do a little overview of what we do as far as endangered species management. And then because all these birds I'm going to talk about are living in marshes, explain what makes some marshes better than others. Go over a few of our rare marsh birds that are found in Maine, and then I'm going to focus in on black terns and some research that we've been doing recently. So quickly, just species management, especially when it comes to rare and endangered species. Our goal is to determine first what their status is, how many are there in the state and where they are, and whether or not their populations are doing well, if they're going up, down, or are stable. And if we're not sure what their populations are doing, then we kind of start looking at limiting factors. So is the amount of habitat or the lack of habitat or the quality of a habitat a problem? Are there certain predators that are causing issues? Is there disturbance factors or even lack of food or a change in the food resources? Really, ultimately, what we're trying to answer is the species at risk? And if it is, what can we do to help it out? So when I talk about marsh birds, these are the freshwater marsh birds that we survey for. When we do marsh bird surveys, these are the ones that we survey for. And I'll just go through them really quickly. These are rails. So we have the Virginia rail on the left and the Sora rail on the right. These are our bitterns. We've got the American bittern on the left and the least bittern on the right. This is an American coot, which is kind of like a waterfowl, but actually they're more closely related to the rails. And then we have another one that's very similar to that. That's the common gallinule. It used to be called the moorhen. We have pied-billed grebes that live in our marshes. Of course, there's herons. This is the great blue heron on the left and the green heron on the right. And common snipe or Wilson snipe is a shorebird species, but they nest in these in our freshwater marshes. They're very similar, I guess, to a woodcock in some ways, which is also a marsh bird. I mean, also a shorebird. And then sedge wrens is one of our endangered species that inhabit marshes, and of course, black terns, which I'll talk about a lot at the end. So what makes a marsh bird friendly? There's all sorts of things that go into, whether or not a marsh bird wants to be there. The water depth will determine where these birds can feed. Water level fluctuations might affect nesting, especially if they're nesting kind of on the ground or on top of vegetation. The plants that are in the wetland might be food sources or food sources for prey that these birds rely on. The topography, whether or not the wetland is close to upland sites, whether there's uplands within the, interspersed within the wetland, how big the wetland is, how connected it is to other wetlands, and then also the diversity of types. So there's all sorts of types of wetlands. There's shrub scrub, there's emergent, there's open water, there's shallow water, there's forested wetlands. So the diversity can actually, the more types, different types of wetland in a complex can be more valuable. So there's a lot of things that go into whether or not marsh birds might occur in a wetland. And a lot of the species that I mentioned in the beginning really like what we call a hemi-marsh situation, where we have this equal proportion of emergent cover, which is the vegetation that you see in both of these photos, that's interspersed with open water. And usually that open water is relatively shallow, less than 6 feet deep. And so that produces this interspersed pattern that allows birds to have cover, so vegetative cover, lots of places to hide, lots of places to nest, but also ways to get around, which is often using the water that's there. So how do we find these marsh birds? When we survey for marsh birds, we typically play their calls and listen for them to call back, because we call these birds secretive marsh birds. They often don't reveal themselves except by calling. They're not flying around the wetland very often, and a lot of times they're not even out in the open water. So we use game callers or MP3 players with speakers, and we broadcast their calls in a certain pattern where we play the call for 30 seconds, wait for 30 seconds, and hear if they respond. And this is a typical encounter. I'm going to play a little video here with a least bittern, which is one of our rarest species, very inconspicuous, really hard to find and detect even when they are there. But this is typically what you would see or hear. This is a dense cattail stand that's right in front of our face here. You can kind of see the bird moving around in the center there, but it's just like a little speck. It's kind of curious. It's looking at us. It was calling in the beginning, but then it kind of just stays hidden in the vegetation, and you don't really ever get a great look at it. So knowing its call is really important to identifying the fact that it's actually there. And this is what they look like if you were to ever get a great glimpse of them and they're out in the open. So like I said, they're one of our rarest birds. They're endangered in Maine. They like these dense cattail stands. They're our smallest bittern or heron species, even smaller than a green heron, if you guys know what those are like. They are rarely seen flying, but when they do, you have their legs kind of dangle behind them. This is a photo showing some young, and it's a really great demonstration of how they use their toes to kind of grasp the vegetation to move through those dense cattail stands. they're almost more like a rodent in that they'll like burrow through some of these thick vegetation stands rather than fly around. So really different than a lot of our birds on the landscape. I'm going to play the calls of some of these species just so you can hear what they sound like, and maybe you'll hear one in the future and know what to listen for. So these guys do a dove-like cooing call for the most part, and then some different little squawks. See if this will play. So here's another great picture of one. This, I think, is a juvenile. It's not, doesn't have the great coloration of the others that you saw. But this map is from our bird atlas effort, and this was kind of midway through the atlas effort, so it might not show all the points on the map, but the point of it is just to show where we've found some of these birds, some least bitterns in the state. So they're kind of concentrated in central, kind of going down to southern Maine, with a little bit of a concentration of possible breeding up north of Millinocket, but really not found all over the state and pretty rare. Okay, so the next species I'll mention is the common gallinule. They used to be known as moorhens. These guys are threatened in the state, and they are in the rail family. They're a little more aquatic than a rail in the sense that they will be seen swimming around like you see on the right there, but they are pretty secretive. Their vocalizations are a series of clucks that end with some long whining notes, very distinct when you hear them. So this is a typical habitat for them. You can see the cattail stand in the distance, and there is a moorhen in, or gallinule in that photo swimming around in the foreground. And that's what their nest looks like. It looks like a bigger version of a rail nest. If you've ever seen a Sora or Virginia rail nest, that they look very similar, made out of cattail primarily, and those are the eggs. And you can see on this map that they are even more sparse than the least bittern. So we have this, not a population, but they have occurred up in northeastern Maine, up in Aroostook County, but then primarily in the southern part of the state. And here's a gallinule with a coot, which is the next species I'm gonna mention. The coot is even more aquatic than the gallinule, so they are more duck-like in the sense that they do a lot more swimming than the gallinule and the bittern. And let's see, this is a photo showing what their young look like, which is really interesting. They have these wiry feathers or hairs on their head and this very red frontal shield, and it said that if the more red and grotesque, in quotes, the young look, the more they get fed. So, but they have these lobed toes too, which makes them great swimmers, which is a little different than other rails. So their calls are also kind of similar to the gallinule. They're kind of grunting and croaking and squawking notes. I'll play those next. Oop. Let's see, it's trying to load. There we go. Okay, that's enough of that. So these guys build pretty big mound nests, kind of similar to what you'd see for a common loon or maybe even a pied-billed grebe if you've ever seen a grebe nest. But as you can see on the map here, the O's mean they've been observed but not confirmed or possible or probable breeding. So we have very few occurrences where they actually breed in the state. We more often see them during migration when they come down from the north as they migrate through to more southern locales, but pretty rare. Okay, so the next species I'll mention is the sedge wren, and I have the marsh wren on here for comparison as well. These are the two wrens that you would typically find in emergent marshes, and they both have thin curved bills and short rounded wings, but the sedge wren has kind of a shorter tail, shorter bill. It's a little more streaked on top of the head. It doesn't have as much of a eye stripe as the marsh wren, and its undertail coverts are buffy colored rather than white. And so the two top photos are the sedge wren and the bottom one is a marsh wren. And let's see, first I'm gonna play the sedge wren. So their call is very staccato, doesn't want to stop. And compared to the marsh wren, which is a little more bubbly. So hopefully you can hear the difference in those two. But they both build these globular nests, and they'll build many of those in the wetlands. So these would be kind of up in the vegetation in cattails, kind of a few feet off the ground. And they build many of them, some of them as dummy nests to kind of deter, confuse predators, and some are for roosting. But you could see, as far as on the left, we've only gotten, one probable site recently where sedge wrens may nest, and marsh wrens are a lot more common. However, they are kind of isolated to central Maine and to southern Maine, and they are declining in some areas. Okay, so now we're going to get into the black tern, and I'm going to go into a lot of detail about this species because we've been doing some monitoring and research recently that I find really interesting. So the black tern's call, just start with that, is just kind of similar to a lot of other terns. It's just this cudic or just a really kick or kick call, and you often hear it when it's in flight. So I'll play that first. And while it's not a very secretive bird in the sense that they're not kind of hidden in the marshes, they'll be flying around. If black terns are in a marsh nesting and you're near their habitat, they might come and mob you. So they're not as secretive as the others. It's just they inhabit the same type of habitat as these other secretive birds, and that's why I kind of lump them together. So what's interesting about the black tern is, one, it's the rarest tern in Maine. It also is the only one that regularly nests in marshes. So these are all of Maine's terns right here. And you've got the Arctic tern in the upper left. You've got the common tern in the upper right, the least tern in the lower left, and then the roseate tern in the lower right. And so among these terns, the black tern's the only one that's got a black body, sooty wings compared to these white terns that we have in Maine. And as far as marsh nesting terns go, there's two other species in the world that are considered marsh nesting terns. They're of the same genus, called Chlidonias, and those are the whiskered tern and the white-winged tern, and those are both found in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Europe and Asia, Africa. And every now and then we might get a stray white-winged tern that shows up in North America, but for the most part, they are on that side of the ocean, and black terns are over. Actually, black terns are here and over there as well. So here's just a little description ID pointers for black terns. So it's easiest to identify them in the breeding season because they have the black body. But then they start to molt around now, after the breeding season's over, and they start to get the white head. And this is what they would look like as an adult. So if you can imagine, they look a lot like other terns and gulls in the winter. So not easy to distinguish, really. The chicks start out all fuzzy and brown and spotted like this in the lower right. But then, and then once they fledge and can fly, this is what they look like. They're a little more smudgy, with a little more of a brownish tint rather than just gray. So keep those in mind. And where black terns occur, at least in North America, primarily they're breeding in the northern part of North America into Canada. The prairie potholes are kind of the stronghold for their population, but then they also winter primarily in marine areas. So they're in the ocean in the winter and in freshwater marshes in the summer breeding time. And interestingly, these guys, while they do eat fish, and they'll eat quite a bit of small fish, they also eat a lot of insects, and they're known for catching insects on the wing, like diving after them in the air, things like dragonflies, mayflies. They'll pick them up off the vegetation or off of the water surface as well. They do a lot of fluttering and swooping, and they pluck their prey from the surface of the water or the vegetation. And like I said, they catch insects on the wing. Oh. I included this video. This is from YouTube, so, but I did credit it. But it's just a wonderful slow motion video showing how graceful they can be when they fly. I'm gonna play that again. And how they might dip down into the water and get something off the surface. So they are not here in the winter. They are down near Panama and Peru and Mexico off the coast. But when they come back in the spring, the adults will do courtship flights where they fly up to 600 feet in the air, and they'll ascend rapidly and swoop and dive. And then the males will fly around with usually a little fish in its bill, followed by the females. The male will be calling with the prey in its mouth, and then the female will follow it. And then when they'll land on the ground, and then the male will feed the female. So they nest in our marshes. These are what's a few examples of what their nests look like. They lay full clutches 3 eggs, but sometimes, excuse me, they'll only lay 2 eggs. It depends. But they are primarily nesting on the middle picture is what is very typical. These little exposed mud areas in a marsh. But then in other spots, they'll be on floating bog mats. So this is like surrounded by cranberry on the left. And then on the right, this is an example where they've used muskrat vegetation cuttings and kind of made them their own little platform on the vegetation cuttings. So they're really close to the water surface and very vulnerable to flooding. And this is a great little video, again, stolen from the internet, but it's just a charming video of a bird coming back to its nest. Getting all settled in to incubate those eggs. So the eggs take about 21 days to hatch. And this is what they look like on the left when they first hatch, nice little fuzzy guys. When you approach a nest, if you were to approach a nest or scare a young, what they'll do is kind of walk off and go into the water and just kind of float and swim on the water surface to try to avoid you. When we're looking for nests and checking on nests, it's really important to just look exactly where we're going so that we're not going to run over a little chick in the water. And then as they get bigger, this is what they look like when they can fly. I showed you a picture earlier. So they'll be flying around the marsh, learning how to feed. The adults will feed them and then show them how to feed before they all head out to the ocean. So then around now, they're probably flocking up on the oceans. They will winter in pretty large flocks, up to many thousands along, like I said, the tropical coastline. So down near Panama, that's kind of a stronghold. I'll show you some maps later from some of the work that we've done. And they'll use almost any type of wetland on their way as they migrate south. They might rest on things that are floating in the sea, but they rarely will sit their body on the water surface. So in Maine, black terns are an endangered species, and we started monitoring these birds since in 1989. It's been endangered since 1997, and they've never nested in a high abundance, but our goal is to just maintain the species as part of our wildlife heritage. We don't expect to have a massive population ever, but we just want to make sure that we can keep them here. So this is kind of a distribution map, and these stars are where they were in 2024, pretty similar to where they were in 2025. We currently have only 4 occupied sites, and where they nest, they often nest in what we call kind of loose colonies. So we might have as many as 20 to 40 pairs at a site. Lately, we have anywhere from 3 pairs to maybe a dozen at a site. So pretty small sites and populations. This is what their numbers have been doing over the years. And on the left axis is the number of nesting pairs, which is these orange bars. And then on the right axis is the number of sites. So you can see that our number of sites that they occupied has kind of gotten down over time since 1989 to 4. And then our pairs kind of peaked in 2005, 2006. And then have really been pretty low the last 10 years or so. The maximum number of nesting pairs that we've observed was in 2006 with 115. The minimum we've had in 1 year is 11. So some years they don't do well at all. But really right now, the last 5 years or so, they've averaged around 34 pairs amongst those 4 sites. And Maine is kind of peripheral to the bulk of its range. So you can see the red on this map. That's kind of the core of where black terns nest. So we're pretty peripheral in their range. But there is a long-term declining trend that's occurring across their range and even in the core area. But we're not sure what's going on and what's causing those declines. There has been some habitat loss and degradation primarily in the central part of their range, but it's not considered a limiting factor. And especially in Maine, our wetlands are still pretty high value where they nest. And so we don't think that's the issue. They do have some low annual survival rates, both of the adults, and then recruitment of the young is pretty low. So these rates are kind of estimated to be lower than what's required to maintain a stable population, and this is throughout their range. And lots of gaps in knowledge, as with a lot of birds that we have out there, but what is their habitat use and productivity in the core of their range? We don't know a ton about their migration timing and routes and where they stop over, or what their wintering locations are like and what the conditions are there. And then for all the places where they breed, how are they connected to their wintering grounds? Or is there mixing of these populations? So really, is there anything going on during the non-breeding time that could be causing or influencing these declines? So back in 2021, we kind of joined a study that was going on by a graduate student at the University of Saskatchewan, where he was putting out geolocators, which are light level sensors on these small little transmitters that you can see here on the right, attached to a band that goes on the foot of the bird. Basically, they use the sunrise and the sunset times to predict the location of where that transmitter is or where the bird is. They're very lightweight. They're like 0.3 grams. So they can go on a bird that weighs only 7 grams. These birds weigh in the 50 to 60 range grams. So it's hardly anything to them. It's like having another bird band on them. So we've deployed 20 of these geolocators over the last, from 2021 to 2024, and joined this study. They're doing this all throughout the range in North America. In order to put those tags on the birds, we first have to capture them. And so the way we do that is we find their nest, and then we take their eggs out of the nest and keep them safe in a little box with us, while we put a trap over the nest with some dummy eggs. So on the right is the trap that has, there's actually a hole in the top. It's really hard to see, but there's a hole in the top. Those are dummy eggs. The idea is the adult will come back to incubate and will go in through the hole in the top and have a hard time finding its way out. We're watching this the whole time. So as soon as a bird goes in there, we go back, we go to the trap and get the bird out to process it. So this is what the geolocators look like on their band. We started out with these tiny zip ties that hold it to the band, and then we use fishing line now. But either way, it's a bird band that a plastic bird band that has the geolocator attached to it. We also color band birds that we don't have geolocators on, so that if we were to see them perched somewhere, like on a channel marker or something, we could say, oh, that's this unique individual, right? That has blue over white on the left leg, as you see there in the right photo. So this is what the maps we're hoping to figure out, how they're migrating, where they're wintering, and then how they're migrating back north. These are from the grad student Nick Shepard. This is some of Maine's data, and I'll show a few other maps, but pretty similar to some of the other birds that have been had geos on them. And we're really trying to contribute to this grander migratory connectivity project. So here's a few other maps. They might be hard to see, but the different colors correspond to the month. And this is each of these are an individual bird and what they did over the course of a year. Some of these are preliminary. So like on this left one, this point over here might be an outlier, but for the most part, they're doing pretty similar things where they're going down to Panama and sometimes even as far south as Peru and wintering along these locations all along the coast. We have a lot of data to dig into, and we're waiting on the grad student to do some final analyses. The other thing that we've been doing is productivity monitoring. And this is really, we're trying to understand, okay, are our birds fledging young each year? Are they nesting successfully? And if they're not, are their nests failing? What are the causes for those nest failures? And we want to know also, are our birds returning every year? Are the adults returning to nest in the same locations, or are we maybe losing some of our adults? So we do this by checking nests ourselves, as well as putting up some nest cameras so that we could document things without too much disturbance. So this is an example on the right of a nest camera on a post, and the nest is kind of out here on this little mud flat in the middle of the marsh. And we can get all sorts of information from this. This is an adult feeding a young bird. This is I think this is at a Beamy lake, where it's very much like a cranberry bog kind of situation, lots of floating mat vegetation. This is a drier site than usual. So we can see things like this, feeding rates. We can also see things like this is a bird taking away one of its hatched shells. Its egg had hatched and it's removing that eggshell. But we could also zoom in and see the bands on this bird. So you can see that it was green over yellow on the left with silver band on the right. So we can that can also contribute to what we know about which birds are returning to our wetlands. We can also see what's happening at night. So we have documented some predators in the nighttime hours, and this is one of them, a raccoon that was at a nest. We've also had fox at a nest. And this is a mink in the middle of this picture. And the nest is somewhere in here as well. So these are the types of things that we're trying to learn more about what's impacting these birds on our wetlands. So the next steps in all this work with the black terns is to continue doing our color banding and resighting the adults. This is an example of how the birds might perch on something, and then we're trying to see those color bands from a distance with binoculars. And then we want to recover more of the geolocators. So we put out 20, we've gotten 11 back. In order to get the data from those geolocators, we have to retrieve them and then, get the data off of them in our hands. So they're not remotely telling us the data. So we have 9 more that could be out there on the landscape that we're hoping to get at least a few more to learn what these birds are doing and where they're going. And then we'll continue to monitor productivity, again, looking at nest success, causes of nest failure, and fledging rates. So that's all I have, but I'm happy to answer questions. These are our funding sources. So the work that I do is considered non-game wildlife diversity conservation work, and a lot of different funding sources go into that. So if you have a loon license plate, that supports our work. If you've ever heard of the Maine Birder Band program, these are bands you can give a donation towards bird work in Maine and get one of these bands to put on your binoculars or your keys or your camera case. During tax time, remember the chickadee checkoff. And then the Outdoor Heritage Fund has a scratch-off ticket, and right now it's called Dragonfly Dollars. So all that money does go towards this type of work. And that is all I have. So I can stop sharing and see if anybody has any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle. That makes me want to go birding. Not a great day for it. Yeah. So as Martha shared earlier, if anyone has questions, please go ahead and put them either the Q&A or the chat. Either one works just fine. And while people are thinking and maybe typing, Danielle, I'll go with a quick question first. I've seen tags like the bands that go on the ankles and then some that look like little backpacks. Can you talk about the difference between those two and what advantages or disadvantages are?
Yeah, so those are 2 different methods of attachment. And so geolocators can be attached as a little backpack. Usually larger transmitters might be attached by a backpack. It really depends on 1, the species, and 2, like whether or not the attachment you're using needs to be permanent or it's gonna fall off after a year or so. So with this size bird, one of the other ways that they attach transmitters, whether it's geolocators or nano tags, is another one that's really tiny that will ping off of towers that are along the around on the landscape, if you've ever heard those. They could be put on the band like we've done, or they use these leg loop harnesses, and it's kind of like, if you know what like mountain climbers use for like a climbing harness, there's a loop that goes on each leg and then it kind of sits on the back of their body. So that's another way that they've attached transmitters like this to these types of birds. Some of the backpacks with aquatic species, there is some worry about how it influences their ability to dive. So if they have something higher up on their back, it might not be as easy for them to adapt to it. So a lot of terns, they do leg loop or these band attachments.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So once you have a band on the black tern, you've caught it and then released it. Now will they come back into the trap again?
Yes, well, that's our hope because we need to, like, after a year has gone by, we want to get these bands back so that we can get the data off of them. And 11 of them have, put it that way.
Excellent,
So
good.
we've gotten 11 of those geolocators back. They don't always like to. Sometimes we'll catch the same bird over and over. Like we also color band, so we try to target all the birds that are not banded. And so we'll know that this nest, okay, that we tagged that adult, one of the adults yesterday. We want to try to get the other one we saw that was unbanded. And so we'll attempt trapping again, and we'll get the banded adult again. And we're like, no, we don't want you. You need to stay out of the trap. We need to get your mate. So some of them are more, it's like an individual thing. Some are more readily willing to go into the trap, whereas others aren't.
So Danielle, a question came in the Q&A. How can these birds survive with so many predators and mammals around?
I know that, I wonder the same thing because it just seems like the odds are against them, right? Like and that's kind of wildlife in general. It's a rough life out there. There's a lot of predators for all sorts of species. I didn't mention like great blue herons will go after tern chicks. It's more of an opportunistic thing, but that's another predator in these marshes. So, the one thing that black terns are really good at is mobbing. And I don't know if you remember that picture of the mink, but the bird was right up here and the mink was down there, and that bird was actively probably hammering that mink, trying to get it to go away. And the other thing that they do is once they get upset and go after something, once an individual does that, they attract all the others that are nesting nearby to come and form a group and mob. And so that can help too. So that's one of the benefits of nesting near others of the same species, at least for these birds. So I know it seems like the odds are against them, but we do have productivity, even though like every year we have nests that fail in each marsh, but it's encouraging every year that we do see fledglings. And it's like, oh yes, some have made it. And then this year with our banding, this was the first year that we had. So it usually takes like 3 to 5 years for these birds to nest, after they've fledged to reach adulthood. And we had our first 2 birds return that we had banded as chicks. So they are now breeding. So they were banded in 2021 and now they were breeding in 2025. So that was encouraging. So they've made it 4 or 5 years, out on the ocean where there's also predators that come up from underneath. So yeah, definitely it's a rough life out there, but they have strategies to protect themselves and defend themselves.
I think our next question, they want to know how long the tern lives.
Yeah, we have, they're probably around 15 years, maybe 20 at the most. We did have a bird that we banded in 2015. I'm trying to remember. It was an adult then, so it was at least 3 years old. And then we recaptured it, I think it was last year, so 2024. So that bird was around 12 years old. And so that was great to see that too. So yeah, they're around 15, I think, is kind of their average lifespan, probably. Of course, some are less and some are more, but good question.
Yeah. All right, well, if people are still thinking of another question or two, I'm gonna just say also our Friends from the Field webinar next month will be on October 23rd, and our speaker will be Jessica Sayers from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. We'll be talking about shoreland zoning and ways to protect and conserve our shorelines now that we're facing more frequent and intense storms. That actually makes me think of the terns too, like how they're dealing with all of the changes offshore whenever they're migrating. But if folks are good with their questions for now, I just want to say thank you so much again Thank you, Danielle, for joining us and for sharing your time today. These are birds that some of them I've never seen before. Now I'm really excited to try to find them. And thank you so much, Martha and Island Heritage Trust, for joining us. Oh, I did see another. Oh, I just see a comment, Danielle, that says excellent. So that's a nice comment that came in.
Thank you. Oh, that's Andy. Hi, Andy. Andy helped out with our heron tagging and tracking. So good.
Nice, nice. Well, thanks, Andy, and thank you everyone else for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we will see you next time. So I will just go ahead and say goodbye. So thanks, everybody.
Right.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Oh,
Danielle.
nice to
Thanks,
see you.
Martha. Bye,
Take care.
everyone.
Take
Bye.
care.
Bye.